Pardon our dust, but we have some construction going on here at Barking Dog Studios. As a result, we're going to revisit some of the most popular segments ever aired on our program. We start way back on episode 83 and explain why feeding your soil yields better results than feeding your plants. Sound confusing? It's actually quite simple. Also, you can learn a lot when you hang out with retired college horticultural professor Debbie Flower at a nursery. We recently spent a morning looking at all the snail and slug control products that are available. Which are the most effective? Which ones, shall we say, are dubious? We'll find out. And from way back in episode 9, maybe it's time for you to grow your own protein. And I'm not talking about a backyard full of creatures that moo, cluck, and oink. I'm talking about garden plants that are rich in protein. For example, did you know that a cup of dried beans has about 80% of your daily protein needs? But there's so much more you can grow to get your protein. We talk with master gardener and vegetable expert Gail Pothour about tips for growing protein-rich plants. Oh, it's all in today's Construction in Progress episode. Some of our favorite segments. It's episode 333 of today's Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. Excuse our dust, if you will, please. We're podcasting from Barking Dog Studios here in the beautiful Abutilon jungle in suburban Purgatory, where even the dogs are in hiding with all the construction going on. And watch your step. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, brought to you today by Smart Pots and HeirloomRoses.com. Let's go. You know what's fun to do is to hang out at a nursery or garden center with our favorite retired college horticultural professor, Debbie Flower. Recently, we visited a local nursery and wandered over to the slug and snail control aisle. There's certainly a lot to choose from there. Let's talk a little bit about mechanical, cultural, physical controls for controlling these pests, which are soon, you're going to find them in places you don't want to find them. And probably where they are right now is under some protection.
In the mulch and in the soil, I was planting a plant the other day into my landscape, and I found their eggs in my field soil. I use lots of mulch. They love that. They like wet places. So they could be in the drain holes of a pot that you have outside. They could be, I have a bird bath, and the birds take a bath and some water goes over the side. They're probably right under that bird bath base. Any place that in my raised bed, they're probably between the wood and the soil. They during the day they need to hide in moist, cool places, and so they're tucked in these little corners.
So if you know where the moist places are in your yard, and especially if you have plants with a lot of green foliage year-round, like agapanthus, underneath piles of lumber, that's where you're going to find them.
Yes, and speaking of piles of lumber, that's one of the mechanical controls, is to put out a piece of wood and let them collect under it. They'll come out at night to do their feeding, and then they'll collect under the wood because that's a nice protected spot in the morning, and you go out and pick up that wood, and there will be slugs and snails attached to it or under it, and that's a way to collect them and dispose of them.
You mentioned that you found their eggs. What do their eggs look like?
Their eggs are white and round and small. If you know what time-release pelleted fertilizer looks like, it looks very much like that. Small as in eighth of an inch, maybe a little bigger than that around.
Pretty good size.
Yes, they are. They're very visible. Sometimes they're in big clusters. There was a time when we unpotted a plant to transplant it at school up into a bigger pot, and 50% of this 4-inch pot was full of a whole bunch of slug eggs. So sometimes they're in a big collection, and sometimes they're just individual. What I was seeing was individual, dispersed throughout the soil. May have been that I disturbed the mess and spread them myself. But they're wet. They're white and sort of translucent, and they're wet because their whole life of a slug depends on moisture.
What did you do with the eggs?
I just left them and put slug bait out.
Okay.
If it were a whole collection of them, Well, actually, I was popping them.
Okay, all right.
When I could get to them, but I know there are more than what I saw. So I planted the plant and then I have lots of mulch, and that's a place they like to live, is in mulch, between the mulch and the soil. That's another wet, protected spot. So after I planted the plant and watered it in, always water after planting, and then came out with the slug bait and put that out.
What is the active ingredient that you look for when shopping for a snail and slug control product?
I prefer an iron phosphate type product. It will say that. There's always a list on a pesticide label that says active ingredients, and it will say iron phosphate. This one says sodium ferric, EDTA. That's something different. This one says metaldehyde, and that's a different product. The metaldehyde I prefer not to use because it's poisonous to small animals like pets. They have to eat a lot of it to be harmed, but I'd rather just avoid that. I have never used the sodium ferric EDTA. Sodium is not something that is good for plants. They need a tiny bit of it, but not much. And a buildup of sodium in my soil would concern me. Sodium, like in your table salt. But also the iron phosphate has its downside. If you use too much, it is toxic to worms. So when you apply this, you need to look at, there's a whole big booklet about application.
And it's actually, when you apply these granules, you apply them very sporadically. There isn't very much you have to put down.
Sparsely, right.
Sparsely, it's like what, a teaspoon or a tablespoon per?
I think it's a tablespoon per 100 square feet.
Wow.
So a 10 by 10, maybe your whole vegetable garden is 10 by 10.
Yeah.
1 tablespoon. And that's because it can be toxic to worms at a higher population.
Yeah, and you read the warnings on the back too, and usually I say, well, you choose the one with the less toxic signal word, the 3 signal words: caution, warning, and danger. And everything that is here has the least toxic of the signal words of caution. But then you go and read the labels. And I'm looking at the one with sodium ferric EDTA, and it says, caution, causes moderate eye irritation. Avoid contact with eyes or clothing. Wash thoroughly with soap and water after handling and before eating, drinking, chewing gum, using tobacco, and using the toilet. And then if you pick up the product that has metaldehyde for the active ingredient, the precautions and restrictions include this warning: this pesticide may be harmful to children and fatal to dogs and other domestic animals if ingested. Children and dogs may be attracted to metaldehyde products, both in the package and when applied. Children and domestic animals must be kept out of treated areas from the start of application until the applied product is no longer visible. And they're not kidding. If it's on the label, it's the law.
It is. Labels are law. Yes.
So that's why we always say read and follow all label directions.
Okay.
Now you're looking at the iron phosphate product?
I am. Says similar to what the sodium ferric one did. Causes moderate eye irritation. Avoid contact with eyes or clothing. Wash thoroughly with soap and water after handling, before eating, drinking, chewing gum, using tobacco, and using the toilet, which is almost the exact wording.
It is the exact warning. So then of the 3 we looked at, the iron phosphate and the sodium ferric EDTA would be the least toxic.
Correct. Right. There's one more product here that I have not used much. Have you used this one?
Yeah, that one, because it has 2 active ingredients. It has iron phosphate and it has spinosad. So basically, not only does it control slugs and snails, it will also control things like, turn it over and let's read it. Oh, roly-polies. I like roly-polies.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to open the big booklet label on the back of the pesticide. Treat it gently in case you don't buy it and you want it to look nice for the next person. But the label is there to be read. Okay.
Pest controlled.
Earwigs, cutworms, sow bugs, pill bugs, crickets, slugs, and snails. Oh. I don't use this one much because I would rather keep things in balance in the garden. But when I have little baby, either I've put seeds in the garden, direct seeded into the garden, or I have put very young, tender babies into the garden, I will use a little bit of this around those plants because the earwigs cutworms, sow bugs, and pill bugs and crickets will eat young plants. And so I'm just trying to protect that plant until it can grow out of that stage where it's attracted to those insects.
And yet, here's another product for snail and slug control. I don't think it kills them. I think it just repels them. But the active ingredient are various oils like rosemary oil.
Yes, and I wondered, see attached booklet, I wondered if you have to actually touch. Well, this says use on fruits, vegetables, citrus, and ornamentals. Yeah, citrus is a favorite of slugs and snails. And it says it controls slugs and snails by contact or as a repellent. So apply it directly to snails and slugs. As a repellent, apply it directly to the plants when feeding is first noticed. Apply in late evening for best results, which makes sense because the oil will be the strongest when you first apply it, and the slugs and snails feed at night.
Now I'm wondering if there are temperature restrictions on the use of this product. I would think using an oil on a hot day on a plant may not be a good idea.
Yes, they don't mention that here, but you're absolutely right. You wouldn't want to apply this when the temperatures get above about 85 degrees. Yeah. It would spot your plant. You would see damage to the plant. Not much else. It's also a caution label, which is the
least toxic of the three signal words.
Correct.
Yeah.
And has the same, well, it says, harmful if swallowed, avoid breathing the mist, may cause irritation of nose, throat, or skin. We haven't seen that before. Avoid contact with skin, eyes, clothing, wear protective eyewear, waterproof gloves, wash thoroughly with soap and water after handling, before eating, drinking, chewing, or using tobacco. Remove and wash contaminated clothing before reuse. Keep all persons and pets out of the treated areas until spray has dried.
But you can chew gum.
Yeah. So although when reading the label, it sounds like it's the least toxic of the chemicals, it has more PPE, personal protective equipment, that they specify you wear. And it has can potentially cause more damage to your respiratory system than the others. So different things to consider when you're choosing your slug and snail control.
That, of course, Debbie Flower, America's favorite retired college horticultural professor, will have more tips on snail and slug control in today's show notes. Check it out. I'm pretty picky about who I allow to advertise on this podcast. My criteria, though, is pretty simple. It has to be a product I like, a product I use, and a product I would buy again. And you know who checks all those boxes? It's Smart Pots. Smart Pots is the oldest and still the best of all the fabric plant containers that you might find. Smart Pots are sold around the world, and they're proudly made 100% right here in the USA. Smart Pots come in a wide array of sizes and colors and can be reused year after year. Some models even have handles, and that makes them a lot easier to move around the yard. Because the fabric breathes, Smart Pots are better suited than plastic pots, especially for hot climates. That breathable fabric has other benefits too. Water drainage issues? Not with Smart Pots. Roots that go round and round choking the root ball like they do in plastic pots? Doesn't happen with Smart Pots. These benefits will help you get a bigger, better plant than what you've gotten in the past with the same size plastic or other hard container. Smart Pots are available at independent garden centers as well as select Ace and True Value hardware stores nationwide. To find a store near you or to buy online, visit smartpots.com/Fred. And don't forget that /Fred part. On that page are details about how, for a limited time, you can get 10% off your Smart Pot order by using the coupon code FRED, F-R-E-D. Use it at checkout from the Smart Pot store. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information about the complete line of Smart Pots lightweight, colorful, award-winning fabric containers. And don't forget that special Farmer Fred 10% discount. Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planter. Go to smartpots.com/Fred. Hi, everybody. Farmer Fred on the road at Eldorado Nursery and Garden in Shingle Springs. It's Plantapalooza. One of the speakers that is appearing here today works for Kellogg Garden Products, and she is a big advocate of doing things organically and also building up your soil. Giselle Schoniger, she's their I guess they're organic teacher at Kellogg's.
That's right. Thank you so much for having me on your show. You're such a delight. You know, I think that my background is, as I've shared with you in the past, actually is in the use of chemicals. I went to a production agricultural school, and about 16 years ago, I transitioned over to organics, and I've helped build 3 different brands of organic products. I've been with Kellogg's for 11 years, and I tell you, all my soil and fertilizer classes made far more sense when I started working with nature instead of trying to control her. And, you know, I think that when we look at fertility of how we feed plants, most of us that are using chemical fertilizers to feed plants, that is what we're doing. We're feeding the plant, but at the expense of the soil.
What a lot of people don't realize is you should be feeding the soil, not the plant. If you feed the soil, you will be feeding the plant because that's how the plant gets its nutrients.
Absolutely. When we look at chemical fertilizers, and, you know, now this is just part of the story. It's not just about NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But when you see a 30-30-30 NPK or 20-20-20 or a 16-16, that material is a chemically formulated product. It's salt. It's a salt-based product. It forces that plant to grow, and it creates a plant with a very thin cell wall, thin leaves, stems, and flowers. That plant is like an attractant to insects and diseases. But the damage is what we're doing below the soil. Those salts kill off beneficial life. And when you kill the good guys off, now you have a proliferation of disease-causing pathogens. Organics work in the opposite fashion. An all-purpose fertilizer might only be a 4-4-4 NPK, but it's about feeding the life in the soil, as you just said. So when you build good life in the soil, the natural good guys will always eventually outcompete the bad guys. And above ground, the plant has a thick cell wall, thick leaves, stems, and flowers. That plant now has more of a resiliency. It has a better immune system, if you will, from insect and disease attack.
What are the key words on synthetic fertilizers that would indicate it contains salt?
Well, you know, actually most people wouldn't know that on a fertilizer. You wouldn't really understand that that is really what the component is. When it goes down through the soil profile, chemical fertilizers, very much like, let's say, steer manure. You know, 50 years ago, steer manure was a good product. But when you think about how confined the animals are, how regimented their diet is, they're not grass-fed often. So it's high in salt. Those fertilizers are also high in salt. When you add a salt material to a clay soil, let's say, you're only going to compact that soil further. So, but back to your question, really, anytime you see a material where the NPK is higher than, let's say, a triple 12, and you see something like urea or ammonium, those are the kinds of things that should really alert you to the fact. If you can't really read what the words are, like on a lot of the food that we eat today, pretty much those are going to be materials that are artificially formulated.
Now, you mentioned steer manure and the amount of salts it has, and I imagine a lot of people are asking themselves now, well, wait a minute, steer manure, isn't that an organic fertilizer? Wouldn't that be good for the soil?
Well, steer manure, a lot of people use it. Let me put it this way. It is better than not using anything. But it is truly high in salt, so it's a value product. I mean, of course, people use it, and everybody's watching their page, you know, their pocketbook, which we all have to do today. So if that's what someone chooses to use, but just know if you're adding it to a clay soil that's already compact and dense, you're truly making the soil more compacted and more dense by adding that salt. So we have other types of manures. We have some chicken manure. We have a product called the Gardener and Bloom line. Has a product called Harvest Supreme. It does have 15% chicken manure in it. It has mycorrhiza. It has earthworm castings, kelp. We add a whole host of organic nutrients within that material. So we have a whole breadth of product lines. We have worm castings. Worm castings are awesome to add into your either raised bed or in-ground plantings, and are not going to be as high in salt.
And you don't need that much worm castings for it to be effective either.
I love worm castings. I tell you, if people would really start using worm castings or create, I have a worm bin, which I love. It's like a science project the first few times you do it, but once you get the hang of it, you realize you're really not doing anything except feeding them. The worms are doing all the work. And you can have some fun with some of these materials, especially in raised beds. This has become the new trend over the years, is instead of dealing with our hard pan native soil, if we build a raised bed. Now, I taught gardening as therapy. I worked as a horticultural therapist for 10 years in convalescent homes. At that time, it was really for people in wheelchairs. But when we look now, why not raise the garden up to us? We're getting older, Fred. Yeah. It's nice to have that raised bed. But the beauty is we get to layer in the kind of materials that we need. If you find that it's getting compressed down, fluff it up with some materials. Our soil building compost is great for adding. I look at that product as fiber. Just like we need fiber. Now, this is a little bit of a stretch, but just like we need fiber to keep our system functioning properly, the soil needs fiber as well to aerate it, to open it up, to help with drainage, to allow the beneficial aerobic microorganisms in the soil to allow them to breathe. Because if it's too compacted, that life in the soil can't breathe, which means the roots can't breathe, which means water can't percolate through the soil. So raised beds are fantastic, and you can have some fun by adding in different types of materials as you go through the season. It's fascinating, this whole movement that we're seeing. It's almost like the Back to the Earth movement finally arrived from the 60s and the 70s. And I think because we're so involved with technology, people are on the road more. Our lives have become so hectic that this idea of growing our own food and slowing down a little bit has really become part of our culture today.
It boils down to, if you feed the soil, you're feeding the plants.
That's right. It's a totally different approach. We took a detour in the early 30s and 40s when we started using synthetics, really in the early 1940s, right around World War II, when we started creating a lot of these synthetics. We were using minerals. Farmers were definitely, a farm was like a closed system. All the organic matter all the manure got composted and put back into the earth. But when we started focusing on production, it's really sort of a misnomer that we created more food, because what we really did is we destroyed the soil system. We farmed the very life out of the soil, and in over maybe a decade, from the 1940s into the 50s, we had to triple and quadruple the amount of chemical fertilizers we were using to try and get the yields that we were getting in the first few years. So it's really, truly a misnomer to say that we increased yields. That was a short-term, temporary result. And you're right, Fred, it's about feeding the life in the soil. The organisms in the soil secrete enzymes that break organic matter down. I mean, if we didn't have all this biology in the soil, the earth would be full of debris. But they're cycling these nutrients back into the soil, and roots then pull from the soil what they need when they need it.
All it takes is mulch, all it takes is compost, maybe a cover crop or two, and you can have healthy soil as well. Well, Giselle Schoeniger from Kellogg Garden Products, thanks for spending a few minutes with us and telling us about our soil.
Thank you, Farmer Fred. It's been a delight. Thanks to all of our customers and all of our listeners out there. Thank you so much for your support.
For spring, summer, and fall colorful blooms, it's hard to beat roses. And now is a great time to get the best roses from heirloomroses.com. Heirloom Roses, it's a family-owned business. They're based in Oregon. They grow over 900 varieties of roses for gardening in USDA zones 3 through 10. So what are the best roses? Well, to start with, choose a rose with the best roots. And that would be roses that are grown on their own root system. And that's exactly what they do at heirloomroses.com. Own root roses will outlive and outshine grafted roses from the big box stores, resulting in stronger disease resistance, a longer lifespan, and stunning blooms that are always true to the variety. At heirloomroses.com, they carry over 900 rose varieties, so you're sure to find a rose you'll fall in love with. And as a special offer for our listeners, Heirloom Roses is offering 20% off all roses with the checkout code FRED20. Use that code at checkout now through October 31st, 2024. It's time to experience growing roses the way nature intended, on their own roots. Visit them at heirloomroses.com to find your next rose today. And be sure to take advantage of that 20% off at checkout with code FRED20. That's FRED20. Find that direct link for that discount in today's show notes. It's heirloomroses.com. Well, whenever we get questions about growing vegetables, we turn to our vegetable expert, Master Gardener Gail Pothour. And Gail, protein in vegetables, is there some?
There are. Actually, there are quite a few. I think probably one of the highest protein vegetables would be dried beans. And there's a lot of great dried beans out there. They're one that I grow every year, something you can store for a year or two, and great high protein.
Yeah.
Grow.
And you can put them in all sorts of dishes, crock pot, slow cooker recipes, and side dishes, main dishes.
Eat them with rice. Yeah, if you eat it with rice, it makes it more of a complete protein. So, yeah, they're great.
Beans have as much as 41 grams of protein per cup. So, yes, that is an excellent meat substitute if you're looking for protein and you want to grow it in your backyard. So how do you grow dry beans? Which varieties do best?
You grow dried beans just like you do green snap beans. And they grow as bush or pole, so those are the two different types. Bush beans, you generally grow a couple feet to maybe 3 feet tall. May need a structure to kind of support them, maybe not. Pole beans can grow quite tall, so you do need some sort of a TP or wires for it to climb up, but they're really easy to grow. They're not particularly drought tolerant. They need regular water throughout the season. However, there are some varieties of dried beans that come from the arid Southwest, and so they could tolerate a little bit more water stress.
Do they have different productions? Do bush beans produce less than pole beans?
Bush beans tend to produce kind of all at one time, and it's a shorter period of time. Pole beans take a lot longer to grow. Still not terribly long, but they produce over the whole season. So if you're growing them for a green bean, for a fresh bean, you can harvest them all along. But if you're growing them for dry beans, you want them to dry on the vine or on the bush. So that takes an additional several weeks.
All right. So what are some of your favorite bush and pole bean varieties to grow?
My favorite of all time dry bean is called Yellow Indian Woman. It's an old heirloom, and the pole type. Actually, it's a runner type, which is sort of between a bush and a pole. But the variety I've been growing, I don't know if it's adapted to my climate, but mine now reaches about 8 feet tall. So mine has turned into a regular pole bean. But it's a small yellow bean that is sort of reminiscent of a black bean in flavor.
And what color is the bean itself?
The bean is kind of a golden yellow.
Okay, so
small little squares.
And again, the name of this bean?
Yellow Indian Woman.
Yellow Indian Woman.
Mm-hmm. And I was first introduced it by Rancho Gordo beans. It's heirloom beans out of the Napa area. And it's one of his best sellers, and it's my favorite.
So how do you create dry beans? You mentioned to let them stay on the bush or on the pole until they're completely dry, but then how do you prepare them to last a long time?
Well, what I do with mine is I start harvesting the dried pods. I don't want to wait until they all get dry on the vine because they'll start to shatter and then the beans will drop out. So I'm out there every couple of days picking off any of the dried ones. I sort of keep them in a bucket until I have nothing to do in the middle of winter and I sit there and shell my beans. There are techniques where you can put them on a tarp and walk on them and that sort of thing. I've tried that. To me, it's kind of messy, so I prefer to just to sit there while I'm watching TV and individually shell the beans. Then I have learned from one of the commercial growers of Yellow Indian Woman beans, he says to put them in the freezer for about 3 days, no more than 3 days, to kill any insect eggs. And then you can store them without worrying about something hatching out and making the holes in the beans. And it will not affect the germination. If you freeze them for 3 days, they will still germinate so you can grow them next year.
I would imagine that they have to be completely dry for you to be able to store them without developing any sort of molds.
Right. And when you harvest them, when the whole pod is already dry and papery, the bean is pretty hard inside. So I let them sit for a few more days and then I freeze them. You can also spread them out on a baking sheet, 175 degrees for about 15 minutes. That will kill any eggs as well.
And I would imagine, too, that when you take them off the shelf to put them into a meal come wintertime or whenever, you would have to soak them overnight.
You can. I find with this particular variety, I can soak them just for a couple of hours and cook them. They tend to cook up a little bit faster than some varieties. Some of the larger, like a Christmas lima or some of the larger beans, take a little longer to cook. This particular variety cooks in about an hour if I soak them, for a few hours ahead of time.
For people just starting off gardening, sometimes when you introduce them to heirlooms, bad things happen. I'm not saying that heirlooms have problems, but sometimes heirlooms have problems. Are there any hybrid varieties that you like that would make a good bush bean or pole bean that are easy to grow?
Dry, a typical snap bean. My favorite snap green bean is called Stripe. That's the one I like. You could dry that. It doesn't have quite the flavor of a bean that is grown just for drying, but you could do that.
The Vegetable Research and Information Center at UC Davis has a lot of recommended varieties of beans to grow, like Golden Crop wax bean, the resistant Cherokee wax bean, and several snap bush green bean varieties, including Contender, Harvester, Roman, and Tender Crop. Among their pole bean recommendations, Kentucky Wonder, Romano, and Scarlet Runner. And they point out, too, that growing soybeans is becoming quite popular in home gardens because of their very high protein content. All soybeans are edible, but those in garden catalogs have been bred to do well under ordinary garden conditions, and they usually require a shorter season, and they're not growing as tall as the field types. Soybeans are quite delicious when harvested as green shell beans, but may also be allowed to dry on the vine. The pods of soybeans, though, are rather difficult to open. You may want to cook them for a few minutes to soften the pod before removing the beans. If you want more information about dry beans, go to the Vegetable Research and Information Center link in today's show's notes, and it'll take you to the UC Davis VRIC bean page. Any other dried bean varieties you want to mention?
Yes. One called Goat's Eye of the Goat. That's a good one. It's another heirloom, but it's a good dried one. And there's one called Rio Zape. It is kind of chocolatey in color, chocolate and purple in color, and has a little bit of a chocolate flavor. It's also listed on the Slow Food Arc of Taste, and that's a good one as well.
Another food you can grow in your backyard that is high in protein, 35 grams of protein per cup. I think I've grown this a couple of times. You've probably grown it more. Peanuts.
Peanuts. We have grown it one time out at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center maybe 10 or 12 years ago. We haven't tried it since, although it would be a great thing to grow if you have children or grandchildren. It could be a fun crop to grow.
Exactly. They can dig down and find them.
That's right. And peanuts are a legume, so it's a bean. It's not really a nut. It's not like a tree nut. Needs to take full sun. You need to have really light, friable soil, because what happens after it flowers, has a little yellow flower on it, then that flower kind of withers and the end of it goes down into the ground. It's called pegging. And then that's where the peanut will form underground, sort of like potatoes do.
Yeah, exactly. It is almost just like potatoes in that it forms underground. And they're ready, I believe, when most of the foliage on top is browned?
Yeah, the foliage does turn yellow and starts to dry back. And so then you could take a digging fork or a spade and kind of loosen the soil to pull the peanuts out. They're attached to stems, and a typical plant might have 30 or 40 peanuts on there if in a perfect world. And you'd pull them out, and then you kind of let them dry for a couple of weeks.
Another high-protein garden treat, that I know you've had experience with this one, and it kind of does double duty because you can eat the outside and then you can eat the seeds, and that would be squash seed kernels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the pepitas is what the seed is called. And I would recommend that if you grow a pumpkin for the seeds, that you get one that's a hull-less variety. If you're familiar with squash or pumpkin seeds, there's kind of a hard shell on the outside. And the ones that are hull-less have a thin membrane instead of that hard seed coat. So it makes it much easier to kind of process after, when you toast them or whatever. You don't have to take them out of this hard seed. Some of the hull-less varieties that you might look for is one that we grew last year. It's an All-America selection, and it's called Pepitas Hybrid. There's also Lady Godiva, which makes it sound like it's naked, and Khaki Hull-less. So those are ones that would be pretty easy to find if you wanted to grow the hull-less type pumpkin seeds.
And again, those are all winter squash varieties. They're pumpkins, obviously. Just look for the words hull-less, naked seed, oil seed, or styrian in the variety description. And, of course, you can make the pumpkin pie and then have the seeds for dessert.
Yeah, some of those might not have the best flavor for pumpkin pie, but you could certainly, put it in a stew or something. There are separate pumpkin varieties that are typically grown for pumpkin puree.
Here's a fun backyard crop that I know kids enjoy, and it's certainly dramatic. If you've got some sun in the backyard, grow sunflowers for sunflower seeds, which are high in protein.
Right. I'd look for don't get the ones that are pollenless. There's a lot of varieties out there that are grown more for the cut flower trade, so they don't drop pollen, because it tends to be kind of messy if you have it on a vase on your table. So get ones that have pollen. The pollenless varieties do not produce seeds. And then after the petals drop, cut off the head, leaving about a foot of the stalk, hang it upside down until they're dry, and then kind of rub out the seeds.
Do you put the head in a paper bag so the seeds fall in the bag?
Yeah, you can. Sometimes they'll fall out on their own, but typically they take a little effort. You need to kind of rub them out.
Do you have any favorite sunflower varieties to grow for seed?
Mammoth is a good one. That produces a huge head, so you get quite a large number of seeds out of it.
Mammoth.
Mm-hmm. It's also very tall.
And another source of protein in the backyard, if you want a tree, are almond trees. And there are some good semi-dwarf and dwarf varieties like All-in-One or Garden Prince. And both are self-fruitful, although usually if you have two different varieties of almond trees, you get better pollination. In fact, for the home orchard, the All-in-One genetic semi-dwarf almond is the best-selling variety. If you have room for an almond tree and you can keep it at the height of a shrub, 6 or 7 feet tall, in order to ease the harvest situation, and makes it easier to net to keep the crows away from it as well.
If you get a variety where you need to have another tree to pollinate it, be sure that they flower at the same time. That's important.
Some of the better pollinizers of other almond trees to have include Butte, Carmel, and Nonpareil. They tend to pollinize many other different varieties of almond trees. But yeah, mix it up and you'll get better pollination. Now, there are two very common garden crops that do have protein in them, not as much as beans, but still a good amount of protein, and that's broccoli and spinach. Two crops that we like to grow here in California as cool season crops between, say, September, October, and April, May. And other parts of the country can grow them in the summertime.
Right. Yeah, here in the Sacramento area, they are a winter crop, which you do plant in the fall. I know in some parts of the country they can grow that in the summer, but not here. We're a little too hot, especially for things like broccoli. When the temperatures get too high, the broccoli tends to bolt or prematurely go to flower. So it's best to plant it here in the fall. And the ideal times to plant it here is in September.
Exactly. And what's nice, too, about broccoli and spinach is because they are cool season crops here, they can get away with being grown in areas that don't get full sun, part shade.
Right. And you could also grow them in a large container. A lot of the cool season crops tend to not be as deep rooted as our summer crops like tomatoes and things like that. So if you had a large container, you could also grow spinach and broccoli in that. In fact, we grew broccoli in the straw bale this last year.
Ah, the straw bale. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have you back to talk about straw bale gardening.
Okay. This is our 8th year, so we've we've been doing it. We're going to probably regret it, but we're growing indeterminate tomatoes in straw bales. So you have a container that's already 2 feet off the ground and indeterminate tomatoes that will get 8 feet. So we're going to try it. We've got a structure set up around it to control it, so we'll be climbing a ladder to harvest, but we thought we'd give it a try.
All right. Always something happening out at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center. If you're ever in the Sacramento area, you ought to drop by and see it in Fair Oaks Park, the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center. Gail Pothour, we learned a lot about protein we can grow in our garden that doesn't cluck, moo, or oink.
That's right. There's a lot of choices. Even if they don't have a lot of protein in them, by varying your diet and have a lot of different things, vegetables to eat, you'll get that protein that you need for every day.
There you go. Gail Pothour, Master Gardener. Thanks for a few minutes of your time.
Okay. Thanks, Fred.
If you're looking to harvest bigger pieces of fruit from your trees and vines this summer, now's the time to get out your hand pruners and thin off that overcrowded fruit. Besides getting bigger fruit, if you do some fruit thinning now while the fruit is young and small, you'll be thwarting disease issues and possibly eliminating the threat of all that weight of the non-thinned fruit from breaking the branches of your precious fruit trees. But how do you do it? Which fruit do you allow to remain on your deciduous fruit trees? Those peaches, pears, apricots, plums, apples, and others. We'll tell you how, and we will also cover thinning your other fruit-bearing plants, such as blueberries and grapevines, as well as citrus trees. And we talk about those fruit-bearing plants that do not need your thinning help because they are self-thinning. All this information is in the May 10th, 2024 edition of the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter, which is available now. If you already have signed up, you've got it in your email. For others, you can find a link to the newsletter in today's show notes or click on the newsletter tab at the top of our homepage, gardenbasics.net. It's the Beyond the Garden Basics newsletter. You can also find it on Substack at substack.com/gardenbasics, and it's free. But if you like the information that you find here as well as on the newsletter and you want to help keep us going and maybe pay for all the construction, you can help support the show by making a subscription pledge at the newsletter. I appreciate it. Daddy needs a new bike, too. Thank you. Garden Basics with Farmer Fred comes out every Tuesday and Friday. It's brought to you by Smart Pots. It's Garden Basics, available wherever podcasts are handed out. For more information about the podcast and transcripts of the podcast, visit our website, gardenbasics.net. And that's where you'll also find out about the free Garden Basics newsletter, Beyond the Garden Basics. And thank you so much for listening.